So I wanted to just welcome everybody to the second session, afternoon session, as we have this conversation about Nate's work. I want to keep the formalities or the introduction or whatever very, very brief. I'll introduce myself and then I'll introduce the others who are going to have some remarks with regard to Nate's work, and we'll get going from there. By way of introduction, I think that it might be kind of cool and okay to sort of read the summary about this session, and that'll also give me an occasion to mention our guests who are in town for this conversation as well around Nate's work and the question of them. So this morning we talked about mood as in music with regard to Nate's work, and this afternoon session we're going to talk about mood and its connection with myth with regard to Nate's work. And given that, I'm going to read here or read the little summary for the session to give you a sense of what we want to begin to engage, and that'll also be an occasion to talk about the presenters. If Mackey's mood takes us to music, then mood also takes us to myth. For the song of the Anabulu, we are told, is mood's momentary, fleeting utterance of life at the rim of the womb, extended, it says, into myth. Or maybe more accurately extended into what is more and less than myth. Myth by way of mood becomes musically anabulous. In N's deep song, we hear what anabulously exceeds myth. We hear myth remixed into what Mackey has called Idham, Y-T-H-M, Idham, what he also calls clipped rhythm, anagrammatic myth. You hear it too in that base cathedral that is Aunt Nancy's church, where N and the Moo crew, the mystic crew, play. You sort of have to see the way I wrote this, I'm sorry. They play Idham and blues, a splayed anthem. All of this invites the question of how myth relates then to mood. In this session, become Idham session, rhythm session. We have four folk who will talk about this a bit. First will be, who's going first? Peter O'Leary. Second will be Gene Ruby. I will go third, Jay Carter, and Norman Finkelstein will go fourth. We're sort of imagining this as a kind of jam session, if you will, on this question of mood and myth, in which mood remixes myth into something like serial improvisations at the sonic threshold, shall we say then, of the sacred. So this is what we're going to talk about, and we'll begin with Peter. Thank you, Peter.
All right, I'm going to adhere to the challenge to keep it short. So what I want to say is myths Ivmic what say. Choric Escort, Chronic Dispatch, Nathaniel Mackey. First, two takes. Let it play on you, Huff said. Let it have its way. I wasn't clear what it was, but my ears perked up. Moo, I knew, had gone into hiding, and it might have been Moo. I wondered, was it Moo he spoke about? In front of us, the waves rolled in. They gave his eyes a glassy look. To see was to see oneself suspended, round insofarian bliss, at the foot of Mount Ida. Huff's Ivmic what say, a smiling spider's bite. That's from Song of the Andambulu 136. We're going to get higher. Another. This is from Sound and Severance, Mu 59th part. Suddenly, two, they sat side by side. He and he looked out the Nod house door. They wanted to go back, wanted not to know what they knew, looked out at the receding world, eyes whiting over. In dreams repeatedly bid goodbye. Choric escort, chronic dispatch. Wondered what but Andambuluousness awaited them. They were waiting to be born, it seemed. Second, Nathaniel Mackie's principal understanding of myth, as demonstrated by his work, is essentially a traditional one from myth studies, the history of religions, and the history of literature. In the introduction display anthem, he invokes Charles Olson, invoking Jane Ellen Harrison, invoking Aristotle, claiming myth as the arrangement of the incidents. Robert Duncan invokes the very same claim in one of the headpieces to The Truth and Life of Myth, an essay impossible not to regard as influential to Mackie. Duncan emphasizes myth's primordiality, its auroral authenticity, writing, "Myth comes bringing to our minds the real of great powers, ceremonies of primal kings. Its persons are beyond our human condition, movers of the universe and initiators of first mysteries. The makers of myth have the grandeur of ancient times surrounding them. They are sages or mages more famous than kings." Likewise, Duncan insists on myth's present tense. Myth gives life form, and men living in that myth live in its history, in its living changes and permutations, not its petrifactions. Duncan's literary understanding of myth conforms with historian of religion Mircea Eliade's definition of myth, who writes, and this is a pretty standard, this is a standard definition. Eliade writes, "Myth narrates a sacred history. It relates an event that took place in primordial time, the fabled time of beginnings. In other words, myth tells how, through the deeds of supernatural beings, a reality came into existence. Be it the whole of reality, the cosmos, or only a fragment of reality, an island, a species of plant, a particular kind of human behavior, an institution." Resounding in Mackie's poetry, we hear sacred history, primordial time, origins, supernatural beings, and in Eliade's words again, the conviction that to know the myths is to learn the secret origins of things. Third, Mackie innovates a classic definition of myth with his insistence that myth activates an ongoingness in consciousness, manifested in the forms of sleep, vision, and incompleteness voiced in broken, gruff, rasped ipseity. In Song of the Andambulu 245, I told you we were going up, he writes, I love this line, "We slept inside myth, but were stirred by Ivum. And furtive gold we the bereft ran with. Not that the golden ones next to never be seen, Anjali, new to our crew, pronounced. It was that the haptic take hold of us, a sense of being run with, auspice more stayed inside than saw, stood inside, run though we would and though we did. We slept inside myth, but were stirred by Ivum." Dynamics of waking and sleeping characterize the ongoingness of myth. In the introduction display anthem, Mackie writes, "Even the Gnostic indictment of history as nightmare and delusion carries a prescribed awakening which, if gnosis is to be Gnostic enough, would have to allow it might itself be only a dream." Added, "To dream is not to dream, but to replace waking with realization, an ongoing process of testing and contesting reality, subjecting it to change or a demand for change. To replace waking with realization. In this sense, myth's ithmic twin is an apocalyptic Gemini, communicative, mercurial, a visitant from the end of time. Fourth, Ithm further innovates myth through its what said interruptions. What saying, narrative interruption and commentary, incidental double-taking, plays thematically the way anagram plays formally. And Ithm, furthermore, points us to one of the peculiar powers Mackie's poetry exhibits, specifically the force of the adjective and the adverb to reorder reality. Ithm is more often encountered in Mackie's poetry as ithmical and ithmically. From Song of the Andambulu 22. Near as I can tell, this is the first appearance of the word. I'm not sure, but as near as I can tell. 22. Rude epiphany dreamt or pretended that there be the illusion something lay in back, loomed above, ubiquitous book, wrought leafless wood, swung book, ithmic sway, he begged, be with me, a new recruit into Ogun's unruly way. And then from Song of the Andambulu 71, holes where the stars were, they fell from. Mythic 7 turned ithmic 2. And then from Sound and Sentience, this is Mu 32nd part. This is also really good. It was feelings return we ran with. Irredentist earth beneath our feet felt good. Irredentist earth fell away from our feet as we kept running. Ran from day one long before day one. Proto-ghost entourage. Leg anthem the music intimated. Spooks it now was on the box. We were anything but there, though not elsewhere. Ithmically elect, but loosed even so. Earth, a dream of drums come true. Fifth, Ithm is as much a provocation as it is a new definition of, or a lateral additive to myth. Ithm asserts myth's ongoingness, musically and linguistically, at the levels of music and language. In this sense, myth is a form of speech, and Ithm is an interruption of speech. As such, Ithm is a poetics of myth. And that's where I stop.
Okay. Oops. Oh, yeah, okay. We're going to step back into a bit more of the quotidian, although Peter's concluding remarks are hard to beat. Okay, so I'm going to, when I first was asked to be on this round table panel, I was really happy to have the opportunity to come here, but I was also a little more taken aback with the fact that the subject would be myth. And so where I started with this, the question of Nate Mackie and myth, is sort of what is or Mackie's relationship to the mythopoetic. And I started with two sort of facts. One was I had been at the Paris Symposium where Mackie had discoursed quite a lot on his poetry, and somebody had brought up the importance of history versus myth. And he had talked for quite some time and was quite upset that this distinction was being made and that myth was being debased. And I didn't take notes from that. Then the second thing I did as any self-respecting critic or poet was I went to his two critical books and looked up myth in the index, and I found out of the two critical books there was one page number for myth in discrepant engagement and empirical him. So that's kind of the profuse and the absence of, say, an abstractable definition. So the form that this talk is taking is I'm using the mu that J. Cameron Carter pointed us in the direction of the last poem in Moment's Omen that has a lot of play with Duncan's it. And I'm marking the difference and the similarities, what is drawn from, what is taken from, what is moved away from in relationship to Charles Olson, Robert Duncan, and Nate's conclusion to mu, all accruing to the one mu 122nd part. Okay, so some people in the audience are very familiar with Olson, some are not. So I'm going to try just a few statements of Olson's. Mythology, this is summarizing, mythology for Olson is the assertion of an original, greater, and more important reality through which a man's present life, fate, and work are governed. Here's Olson be more impassioned. The case of myth is in your hands. You are, whether you know it or not, the living myth, each of you, which you neglect, not only at your own peril, but at the peril of man. For when men lose their mythology, they are dead. Simply that is what used to be called the soul of them. By the law of the soul, if you lose it, you are not alive. Okay, the title of my talk, which I failed to give, is Talk So Near, So Far, or shortened to Near Talk, Far Talk. It would seem that what Wilson is saying is that if there's not enough far or dimension in one's take on existence, that one will never be near oneself. As such, for talk to be near talk, myth is necessary. One must have myth to have near talk. Duncan is also very clear in defending myth. And in this book, which was mentioned, The Truth and Life of Myth, there's wonderful articulate defenses of myth that definitely counter a lot in our present milieu. So I'm going to do something quite short. Duncan claims that at his time, 1960s or so, and I think it's very true now, if not more true, there is a drive to clear away the mythopoetic, the areas of fictional and creative contamination, and to establish a text in the light of what modern man is reasonably convinced is the likely or likable truth of things. So Nate's, in his discussion of Duncan, both is very sympathetic with Duncan and close to him, but also critical of him. And I think one of the things I would say about Nate is there's a combination always of near and far talk happening simultaneously. So when he talks of Duncan, and I think this is one of the reasons I've liked his criticism so much, it's never a cheap act. It's always like, what is the best you can say, and what also might one say in terms of criticism? So in his essay on Duncan, he writes or discusses the problem of the potential inflationary aspect of the mythopoetic, which he says Duncan himself acknowledges. This is Nate. We hear the pathos of an upward aspiration that we both identify with and are put off by, hearing the echo of our own resistance and Duncan's inability to keep the godly voice aloft. The faltering of Duncan's voice speaks of the heart of the condition it laments, tellingly fails to rise above that condition. And in the process of sort of validating Duncan and also critiquing Duncan, he brings in a comment by David Bromwich, which is immensely sympathetic to Duncan. This is what Bromwich said: "The broken chant of yearning to be that other of the will, to be one with what is nearly forgotten, speak from the heart of the condition it laments." Okay, actually I read too far, but basically he brings up Bromwich to say that Duncan wants to be the other of the will. So how does Mackie end Move 122nd part, in which the whole thing is a question of tell us about the one, tell us the myth, the story, the account of the one. And it's the story of it is it. And for those of you familiar with Duncan, you know that it is Duncan's primary term for some unspeakable ultimate reality. So this disquisition, which strikes me a little bit as far talk, that approaches the near by the end as we get to limbo. Mackie writes, "It might all have been only a bunch of stuff, such talk of the one, remote cosmological backdrop, talk so near, so far. A remote political backdrop as well we knew was possible. Deep wavehead, resumption, deadly wheel, and roulette." So I want to conclude by talking about what these writers have in common with each other, Duncan Olson and Mackie. And I would say that they're all very concerned with some version of near talk, or maybe what Peter was referring to as ithem, or the larger question of the round table as ithem. And again, a generalization, I would say all three poets refuse to separate language and reference. Whether language and the world of which it speaks, or a language referencing language. And so in this sense of calling to tasks of language poetry that references language as a complete context of itself. Rather, language is one with which is uttered, Peter was a wonderful example of an utterance. Olson's use of muthos is connected to the Greek word mouth, and these refrains appear in different Mackie poems. Mouth that moved my mouth to song, mouth that moved my mouth to speak. However, to conclude, all three poets tried to talk so near, so far, simultaneously. And I will sort of conclude with, I will conclude, I call it task and sort of the other thing. I will conclude with Duncan, how different his description of his poetry and poetics is than Mackie. Okay? And I think this is kind of a marvelous, daring thing that Duncan says. He says, when a man's life becomes totally so informed that every bird and leaf speaks to him and every happening has meaning, he is considered to be psychotic. The shaman and the inspired poet who take the universe to be alive are brothers germain of the mystic and the paranoid. But he goes on to confirm we at once seek a meaningful life and dread psychosis, the principle of life. So I see Duncan here as equating utterance with a kind of naming that has no possible reference other than the act of speech. Whether one is considered to be a great poet or a psychotic may have much to do whether what other people are willing to go along with what the poet is saying. Okay, here's Mackie's description of his poetics. Like Duncan, he has a respect for unconscious dictate, but he also emphasizes that he has a respect for conscious control, which I'm sure Duncan would agree with, but that's not quite his emphasis. Mackie writes, I try to be as conscious as I can be in writing, whether poetry or fiction, knowing I can't be completely conscious. I try in part to become aware of unconscious, unintended, and auxiliary meanings, implications, and resonances that happen into the writing, that turn out to be alive in the writing, both in the process of writing and in the text in which the process results. Writing is a mix of saying what I mean to say and finding out what else this writing might say. So I would say, in Mackie, there is a summoning words as nominations, or wrenching from context, which calls them into their origins and into their fates, into their past and into their future. There is a bending of language in his words until it creaks. And I think this morning we heard and saw much evidence of that creaking and a set of typing of how that occurs. So in an effort to be conversational, I'm left with these questions. What more can or needs to be said about Mackie's relationship to the mythopoetic, which we're hearing a great deal about, his talk so near so far? And then finally, in terms of the larger critical or cultural studies discourse, language is a social, cognitive, and bodily act. For all three poets, it was the act of the instant. And so as a social, cognitive, and bodily act, I think our own time is very alert to social, and it seems to me that cognitive and bodily have gone missing to some extent. So that's
So I would like to add to this conversation my own kind of, and it's sort of like the story of my coming to Nate's work. It's all bound up with this question of id and the myth. So I'm like formally trained in religious studies, have done a lot of work in theology, and trying to think about theology's complicity in the production of settler colonial formations has really tried to, has pushed me to really try to think about how those operations of the theological have worked. And it turns out that by way of reading folks like Cedric Robinson, along with Nate's work, I started to get some leverage, or at least some sense of a step forward in how these things happen, and also to think about the kind of logics of the sacred that move in distinction from formal theological, institutional, religious institutional capture can open up new possibilities. And the long and short of it is my own engagement with Nate and Nate's work has been trying to think about how sacrality moves poetically. And so what I'm going to read from is really extracted from a larger essay that will be coming out soon in Social Text. And that essay itself, chunks of which will be part of a book that I'm finishing. The subtitle of the essay, as well as the subtitle of the book, is A Poetics of the Sacred. And trying to think really carefully, at least as carefully as I can, to sort of be involved in a conversation to try and think again about how does the figure of the sacred, the notion of the sacred, move poetically. And I think Nate's work is helpful in this regard. Let me say one more thing here as a part of this setup so you just sort of appreciate where I'm going to drop us in and what I have here. I'm going to argue in effect, or at least my reading of Nate's work argues in effect, that the notion of idiom, it really moves in myths and ambivalence, where myth itself, and this I'm picking up from Cedric Robinson's Terms of Orders in particular, where myth itself is precisely what propels settler colonial operations, or in Robinson's terms, what propels the political as we know it. The political is a mythic formation, according to Robinson. And understanding how that mythic formation, that formation of a kind of order of stability, how that works, myth, for Robinson, is part of the explanation of that. When I think about Nate's work, coupled with Cedric Robinson's work, by way of Nate, I get an angle on how the myth of the political, even as it tries to impose an ordered world upon what Eliade would call the larval earth, that in doing that, it's still ambivalent. Its will towards a totality is never complete. And in that ambivalence, idiom yet moves. This is where Nate's work for me comes in. So in what I've written, I try and give as close a kind of an account of what I've just really barely summarized here. And then, by way of Robinson, with the help of Ray Terada, who gave a brilliant talk at UC Riverside earlier this year, in which I was in the audience, who further helped me understand how this works in Robinson's work. After laying that out, I then am in position to then move to how idiom works as a kind of moving in the disturbance of myth in Mackey's poetics. So that's the setup. Now I'm going to drop you in what I read, take you into how I'm reading idiom, and depending on where the time is, I'll connect this to all accruing to the one. Because in all accruing to the one, rather than the imposition of a mythic totality of a stable allness, a stable totality, we have another kind of imaginary of all, where all is always incomplete accruing. Constant motion, movement. It even can take on the quality of dream, as it were. So that's the broad architectonic overview. So now I'll drop you in one of them. All right, right here I say go to page 8. So go to page 8. All right. Okay, so, but what if you do not assume the political, but rather take seriously the fact of the political with Cedric Robinson precisely as myth, or as a myth that is always trying to reckon with what monstrously, with Mackey we might say, infinitely appears as its internal limit, as its anamythic disturbance. What is that? Which is also to ask, what if rather than assuming political theology, where Paul's political theology is a locution for myth in that stabilizing sense, rather than assuming political theology or that mythology, we think with the likes of perhaps a Colin Kaepernick, whose taking of a knee seems to be animated or could be read as animated by what's irreducibly anamythic or anti-political. What if our study and our writing takes place within political theology's astrophysical contraction? What is already released in the wake of politicality? We might, these questions propel this essay's writing practice, which aims to throw language back on itself, thus to be suspended in, even exiled within language itself. I'm suspended beyond the ontology of the sentence of politicality, held in idiom's ellipsis, a cloud of anti-political unknowing. What might it mean to write the experience of semiotic exile? To not be sentenced to the sentence, even if suspended within it. to write the experience of decomposition as the experience of suspension, of suspended, expended sacrality. What not I, can write parenthetical escape from mythic capture, being unsentenced or unheld within the sentence, in the break, like some sisters in the wilderness of the sentence, in the void of political theological sentencing? Can the I escape its own gravitational force, its own civilizational force? What might it mean to occupy, escape itself, live the void and be voided? What's the feeling of the void, the feeling of fugitive suspension outlawed within the law of the sentence? What of this wandering, this unholding? These are Renee Gladman and Sarah Jane Cervenak-inspired questions, and they are Layli Longsoldier and Inua Bezi Phillips-inspired ones, along with Nathaniel Mackey-inspired questions. And so this writing's claim is that the poetics of what is beyond the theopolitical sentence of myth is language's other tensed, where some other experience of language is felt. Here the myth of politicality is always already sacrificed, along with the mode of divinity or the God terms meant to secure the state, or the myth of the state. Therefore, you have to be on the hunt for a meta-mythic poetics. This meta-mythic poetics, this poetics of the beyond is a poetics of the sacred, otherwise, Denise De Silva might say. Given this, the black malpractice of which I here speak is a practice of the sacred overboard from myth, an experience of the sacred detached from or in the absence of its reduction to substance, to the stabilizer that has come to bear the name, theologically, God, or the gods, God or the gods, and as duplicated or mirrored in the divinization of the state, where the state exists in the image of this substantial stabilizing God. What I aim for here then is a practice or a malpractice beyond the mythology of political theology. This is an anatheological practice. I'm after a practice of outside, and out not caught in or that already ruptures the dialectic of inside-outside or the notion of a border or a property line, notions of inside-outside that are at the heart of myths of order, state or otherwise. Blackout is no ordinary outness then. Out even from itself, in critique of the notion of a self, blackness's practiced outness or blackout is ecstatic, ecstatically enthusiastic, black raptured spirit possession. We need a writing for this. Maybe not so much a mythography as a pneumatography. What if Mackey is a pneumatographer? Here I turn to Nathaniel Mackey, for it is in light of his work precisely on myth that much of what I'm trying to say here comes into perhaps some sort of focus. I've come to think about the problem of myth with Mackey. I propose that we consider Mackey as a mythographer and more than a mythographer, a pneumatographer. And to get at what I mean by this, we might consider Mackey's poetics of Mu as worked out in the serial or unending poem that bears the name Mu. Approaching the sound of the first two letters of the Greek-derived word myth, muthos, Mackey's serial Mu poem encodes a poetics not so much of myth, but of what he calls idiom. The re, if not the decomposition of myth, M-Y-T-H, into idiom, Y-T-H-M, is fascinating to think through. With idiom, the first two letters of myth, Mu or M-Y, are inverted. Possessive my becomes inverted into im, Y-M. Further still, im or Y-M in idiom is then split open so as to reveal a kind of quantum but also cosmic, but also womb expanse that holds, between the Y and the M, an infinite set of phonemic, phonetic, or what R.A. Judy might call parasemiotic possibilities. That infinite set of the possible, which is also the impossible, is signified in the repositioning of the other two letters of the word myth, at the end, the TH, this dental phoneme sound, between the now inverted and then spaced out other two letters of the word myth, the Y and the M. The inverted and spaced apart other two letters now hold, or perhaps better, create a space of care, of haptic touch, embrace, what we might even call churchical contact and caress for the dental phoneme TH. Eem is the womb then for a crippled sound now. Mackey at one point says that rhythm is crippled rhythm, created by air vibrating through flesh, air pushed through tongue and teeth, and released through the mouth, but yet never being a completed sound or word. In this way, eem of idem becomes now a conduit of sort, a frictional passage, middle passage may be refunctioned or looked at differently or something, a fleshly resonance hall for air where under duress we might breathe, a space now for pneumatic movement, the pneumatic movement of flesh through Y and M, a harbor now for life held but not had, yet unheld. This is a reference to the poem that opens Mufasa, A Night in Jaipur. Put differently, between Y and M, the TH of myth is now repositioned into an open field in the black outdoors. This is Idem, Mackey's Wu Poetics, which is a black malpractice, a paramythic, anamythic otherworldliness of the earth that exceeds this world, parenthetically, of racially gendered capital. Okay, I'll stop there. There's more stuff, but thank you.
Are we hanging in? Are we good? Okay. Don't need a seventh inning stretch? Remind me to tell you about the seventh inning stretch. I just learned about that. It has to do with William Howard Taft in Cincinnati. This is called Mackey's Mythos. There's going to be a lot of overlap from what you've heard already. When I was asked to be part of a panel on Nate and myth, I knew I was in deep trouble, or as Nate would say it, deep treble. I wondered how I could address this audience steeped in Nate's work, fellow initiates, who would anticipate my every move. So what I will do is offer a set of commentaries, a retelling or reutterance of oral lore, mythos, refugee words from a place that is everywhere and nowhere, from a secret location that may be said to exist only in our mouths and in our ears. Word balloons, little demons, coming from the horns of the band. So here is Jerome Rothenberg from his essay, The Poet as Native. Mythology always carries with it an element of automythology. Mythology as automythology, experience as mythos, reaches its extreme in the self-projections and world creations of tribal shamans and certain post-tribal mystics, and perhaps equally so in the work of contemporary poets and artists as myth makers, narrating the world and their experience of it as a story. The poets and artists' telling is an instance of any person's need to do the same, but with a continuing demand for a heightened self-consciousness and often a quirkiness and openness to change that casts doubt on its own projections. Here, the self, in the process of imaginative reflection, transforms experience into a world. Shamans, mystics, and poets all draw from their experiences to narrate their world, and it is given to them to be especially self-conscious in the process, making and unmaking, casting doubt. So myth in Nate's work is doing and an undoing. In All Cruise to the One, the ubiquitous we are reminded that one was not the one. Huff speaks of the one we have by not having. Annuncia argues instead that there is no one that's not one, the one. What goes down in the poem then is talk so near, so far. In Mackie's work, the mythic impulse is simultaneously expressed and impeded, and he tells us as much in the preface to Splay Anthem, when he writes that both serial poems are shaded or shadowed by rut, the condition they seek to undo or come to new terms with. This is, as Jean-Luc Nancy, as opposed to Aunt Nancy, would have it. I love it. This is myth interrupted. As Nancy observes, the phrase myth is a myth harbors simultaneously and in the same thought a disabused irony, foundation is a fiction, and an ontopoetico-logical affirmation, fiction is a foundation. This is why myth is interrupted. It is interrupted by its myth. Nancy's formulation bears a strong resemblance to Nate's understanding of the ancient concept of mood. And this is Nate. It promises verbal and romantic enhancement, graduation to an altered state, momentary thrall translated into myth. Proffered from time immemorial, poetry's perennial boon, it thrives on quixotic persistence, the increment or enablement language affords, promise and impossibility rolled into one, annuncia nunca. In their promise and impossibility, Nate's sequences constitute an extended translation into a self-interrupting mythos. But what exactly is a mythos? Rothenberg, as we've seen, relates the term to self-projection and world creation. When I consulted various dictionaries, I made some interesting discoveries. On the simplest level, the word is a synonym for myth or mythology. The OED also gives us a definition specific to literary criticism. The general structuring of events presented in the text, especially interpreted with regard to certain archetypal themes or patterns. Related to this, I found a traditional or recurrent narrative theme or plot structure, or more simply, theme, plot. Both Nate and before him, Robert Duncan, are keenly aware of this concept. Both poets draw from Jane Harrison's Themis, a fundamental work in the field of myth studies. And in Duncan's quote, which begins The Truth of Life and Myth, Harrison in turn cites Aristotle. By myth, I mean the arrangements of the incidents. Nate's serial poems are just that, an endless arranging and rearranging of incidents, charged with a primal power that is also entirely responsive to the conditions of the present moment. Returning to the OED, I also found another meaning of mythos, a body of interconnected myths or stories, especially those belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition, more generally an ideology, a set of beliefs, personal or collective. Put somewhat differently, this is a pattern of beliefs expressing, often symbolically, the characteristic and prevalent attitudes of a group or culture. A mythos suggests not only a structuring or patterning of events, reenacting archetypal incidents, but also beliefs. Event and belief are so deeply intertwined in the mythic sensibility that at the root they cannot be distinguished, especially not in any type of artistic representation. Yet there is one more darker definition of mythos, extending beyond a pattern of belief or the historical experience of a people, a deliberately fostered cult. And indeed, there is something weirdly cultic in Mackie's work, or if not in the work itself, then in the reading of the work. Earlier, I spoke of you, my audience, as fellow initiates. But before we all get too weird, thinking of ourselves as part of a cult, let me remind you that the poetic creation of a mythos, by virtue of the fact that it is poetic, entails a self-awareness or auto-mythic quality on the part of both the poet and the reader, which makes and unmakes settled beliefs, or if you will, ideology. By virtue of its turbulence and instability that is both linguistic and psychic in nature, myth in the hands of a maker never ultimately reduces to what the Marxists call false consciousness. That having been said, here is one more passage from Peter's chapter on Mackie in his recent book, Thick and Dazzling Darkness. Put in a plug for you. Peter observes that, quote, Mackie's series have proliferated a wild, idiosyncratic, nearly nonsensical set of locations and personas whose variegated names remain steadfastly opaque even to devoted readers. This is followed by a crucial footnote. Here's the footnote. Listing these names, because he then lists all the weird names in Nate's poetry. Listing these names prompts another comparison. Mackie's personal mythology bears curious resemblance to that of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, which likewise relied on a negative epistemology and whose stories portray characters who intuit, sometimes unwittingly, that horrible nature of the super-reality surrounding them, in which the veneer of normal reality hides the hideous truth of alien realities inhabited by unspeakable beings, too much for any humans to bear without going irredeemably mad. In some respects, O'Leary's comparison of Mackie to Lovecraft is rather perverse. Given Lovecraft's notorious racism and xenophobia, these attitudes do not merely compose a set of personal beliefs, rather, they function as an aesthetic as well as a political ideology, structuring all his writing from within. Hence the paranoia in regard to the alien that permeates Lovecraft's stories, determining both his plot structures and the psychology of his characters, especially his hapless, victimized narrators. One cannot imagine a set of values more remote from those of Nathaniel Mackie, whose resolute cross-culturality in music, literature, and mystical traditions constitutes a forthright critique of tribalism and identity politics of any sort. Yet, in a number of respects, O'Leary's comparison is not only provocative, but quite accurate. He applies the term negative epistemology to both the Cthulhu mythos and what we might call Mackie's Andumbulu mythos. Negative epistemology, arising from the Gnosticism of both authors, points to the limits of human knowledge. That is, the more we know, the more mysterious or unknowable the conditions of our knowing becomes. We know that we do not know. And we know that what we do not know is by its nature unthinkable. In Lovecraft's case, what we do not know is horrible, monstrous, and fully capable of driving us irredeemably mad. As Lovecraft declares in the famous opening lines of The Call of Cthulhu, we live in a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. As for Mackie, what we do not know is neither horrible nor maddening, but it is as every bit transformative. As he writes in All Accruing to the One, this is the risk we took, telling taken back in the asking. No, telling taken back in the asking. A kind of hurt put on us, having to hold as we were warned we'd be. The construction of a literary mythos, based on the risk of telling too much, of venturing too far, produces the cultic devotion which is certainly associated with Lovecraft stories, and which seems to be developing on a smaller scale, maybe a not much smaller scale, a smaller fan base, as it were, in regard to Mackie's writings as well. What reading an author of this sort leads us to recognize is our deep-seated fascination with mystery. Mystery that expresses itself, as O'Leary puts it, as a wild, idiosyncratic, nearly nonsensical set of locations and personas. Mackie's term for this is not nonsense, but as we spoke about this morning, it's nonsonance. Right? A fundamental quality of being in his world, of being mysteriously other than oneself. If a mythos is a body of interconnected myths or stories, an arrangement of incidents charged with cultural or religious significance, then these episodes serve to explain who we are to ourselves, reciprocally revealing our own and their own significance. But a mythos, in this sense, also furthers the mystery of ourselves. In two of Lovecraft's most elaborate narratives, The Shadow over Innsmouth and The Shadow Out of Time, the similarity of the titles cannot be accidental. The plots move inexorably to the discovery that the protagonist is the very thing he has dreaded, or as Mark Fisher puts it, the revelation that I am it, or better, I am they. In Mackie, as he tells us in All Accruing to the One, something ominous began to build as we thought of the One. I could go on about what makes thinking of the One, the primal origin, the first utterance, so ominous, but it's time for me to shut my mouth.
Wow. I'm grateful for this conversation, and I guess maybe how we can proceed forward would be similar to what we did this morning. And we really would like to invite a larger conversation, and perhaps we as a presenting cohort can begin with a kind of internal conversation that is already kicked off to you all too. So maybe we can come up here. And then, like CT this morning, I'll just try to keep my eye out for questions that you all might want to chime in and comments you all might want to make. So, conversation.
I would really like to hear, Jay, I'm fascinated with your repeated use in the, in your talk of the prefix ana, so anamythic. I think you said anatheological at one point. I may have missed that. And I'm curious about why, because that has a kind of Mackian texture to me. Why that prefix is so useful to you as you're coming up with this new language for describing this ethnic kind of phonemic rupture. Because I would think of amythical, or I assumed you were negating in a sense, but it makes me think of like anabasis. It makes me think of anacoluthic. So anacoluthic does not follow. It's the grammatical.
What does that preface mean? I mean, that
Ana,
prefix.
it negates. It's like it does not, but it's different than the strict negation that would be with the simple letter A. Yeah.
No, I think that's an interesting question. I think what I'm trying to do is reckon with what, in fact, I mean, I think you at one point in some of your own formulations were really helpful. I had your paper at my disposal, and I was trying to think about actually, because it's not simply that whatever my critique of myth is, as bound up with the political myth is, it's not as if we're in a position like of a kind of strict, kind of refusal. Whatever refusal is happening through it. We're involved in a working through of some sort. And I think that Anna, in distinction to the A, and sometimes I'll throw an A formulation in while I kind of build up to it, so it doesn't come off as just some sort of strict dialectical opposition. The Anna is my attempt to try and work through the poetry that we're doing.
So it almost suggests process.
Yes, we're inside of a kind of. I mean, you have one formulation yourself, I think, that was extremely provocative for me. You were quoting Nate, I think. We slept inside myth, but were stirred by it.
Yeah.
The sleeping inside is precisely the escape that's happening within, right? And I think that Anna is trying to signify a negation, but it's a kind of like a negation that is going on within, not simply a kind of strict dialectical negation, which for me is just kind of photonegative reproduction.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like that. It's more suggestive.
That made a lot of sense to me in the light of another of your phrases. I was plucking phrases out of your talk, because you spoke also about myth as a cloud of anti-political unknowing, which I think is wonderful because myth stands against a politics in the sense of, and this is another one of your quotes, God terms that secure the state. But on the other hand, it does not necessarily know itself to be doing that. And I would connect this to what I was arguing in regard to Nanci's myth interrupted. Myth is constantly interrupting its own myth. Same with Rothenberg, the kind of auto-mythology. Myth, one of the salient aspects of myth, which I think people don't recognize when they caricature it, has to do with the self-interrupting quality of myth. Or the fact that it does not know itself to be as disruptive as it truly is. If I'm reading it right.
Yeah, I think.
Can I ask a real quick question, Jay, just so I understand? What is the root of the term when you're saying pneumatography? What's the root term? Is it pneuma?
Which is spirit or breath.
PNU. And that's what I wanted to make sure of. Okay. Okay, that's what I thought, but I wasn't sure. Okay.
Yeah, and then but it also refers in Christian theology specifically to the Holy Spirit. So pneumatikos.
Yeah. Well, and within the Neoplatonists, it depends on who you're talking about. It's the jury's out still. Is it breath? Is it related to the ether? Because I've been studying this for a while, but you can't be sure because Plotinus goes one way. It's more like the spiritual breath, but then Proclus goes another way, connects it with the ether. And then Iamblichus does something else. This is just sort of a bone of contention, or maybe
they're just messing with you.
Maybe. Or it's a hegemonical thing. It's like, no, I know better.
But I guess like my own kind of stakes in this kind of work is that, and this goes to like the kind of setup that I was talking about with regard to settler colonialism as a kind of myth practice, a brutalizing, imposing myth practice. Is that what it tries to arrest is certain kinds of modalities, shall we say, of life, or breath, or breathing. And so when I read Matthew's Poetics, or even he's here, Ed Roberson's Poetics, and I can mention a number of others, or Norbertson Phillips' Poetics, and I could just go over Renee Gladden, and I could keep going, is that part of what's at stake is a working through of the imposition for what is released because even in the imposition wills the totality, a total capture, but the total capture is always ambivalent, right? It's in the space of the ambivalence that there's a certain practice of the poetic that's happening, right? And that's pneumatic, and it moves in relationship to a kind of attempt to capture the pneumatic, but it's not simply a duplication of the pneumatic. So we have to make these distinctions on what kinds of forms of spirit movement are at stake with the Anambula, right? If the imposition of the human is one way to capture spirit, then the unfinished human, the Anambulu, is another modality of how we are given to think spirit, right? And part of what Anna is about is trying to understand both the connectedness to that, but the irreducibility, even that's going on even within that connection. And then I think we have another one up here.
So, I want to speak about the notion of the sacred, and I think I'll be extremely provocative and be corrected, and I'm happy to be corrected. But I'm trying to put together the discussion that had set me thinking this morning with this discussion, which was also set me thinking. And I think that I would say that Nate's poems are pretty strenuously secular, even though, of course, the notion of the sacred is relevant. We're reading a poem that is organized as a pilgrimage, but what are we asked to believe? And how do we get from one episode, one passage, to another passage? Is the answer to that question ever one that entails a religious answer? And I think no. Also the question of, is there anyone in the poem who dwells more deeply in the connections between the various episodes and experiences narrated than the reader does? That is to say, is there a model of a religious person? And I think, again, the answer is no. If you think of Pound says, I think Pound was largely a secular person, but he has these religious moments, and he says early in the cantos, gods in the air, bright gods in Tuscan, when he's looking out at Venice. And I think he's inviting a reader into actually a kind of sense of vision. And the linkages that were spoken of this morning, they are based on orthography, homonyms and puns, and the puns derive from, as do the homonyms, from a difference between oral and literate expression. You have to be to get all these connections. You need to be fully sensitive to the recorded language, and that's the basis of transit in the poem. It seems to me that where a religious poet might say, here you need to see the bright gods in Tuscan gods in order to rise above the poverty of Venice that Tom is seeing. Nothing like that is ever really, I don't think, asked of us. Our sense of the puns and the homonyms, they will take you through. That is the movement. So that's what I want to say.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I think one of the parallels that I have found in working on Nate's work is, and I reiterated it here, was the parallel between the shaman in tribal culture, which is oral culture, the mystic, which may or may not be in literate culture, but usually it's oral and then gets written down, and then the poet who is working very definitely within a modern literate culture. And what I have figured is that certain forms, not religious content, but certain forms get reiterated and passed from one of these figures to another, which is what has led me to think about his work as an initiatory practice, which is to say that as in a number of modern and postmodern writers, you're called upon to be in effect initiated into the writing, rather than simply picking it up and reading it casually. I think that seems to be a push in his work, which is absolutely okay in regard to seeing it as secular as well. I mean, it is a secularity, but nevertheless we are called upon to be inside it in some way that is beyond, just even a serious reading. It's an initiatory reading, and I think that really is one of the very, very interesting features that brings it from the sacred into the secular, if you want to put it that way. I'll just make one other note, and it occurred to me apropos of the 2 sessions that we've had. If there were going to be a 3rd session, right? I would say it should be Mackey's word, and then here's real secularity in relation to the erotic, because well, you've spoken about him as a love poet, because this is the writer of Eros too, and it's not necessarily divine Eros.
Can I add briefly to that? Because I think you're making an important point, Bob, which is sometimes when we talk about religious poetry or this poetry in relation to the sacred, there can be a kind of retrograde sense of desiring a cultural milieu or totality in which the sacred was an accepted, was an accepted outlook. And there's no turning back from the secular. So in a sense, anything that has a whiff of the sacred, it really is going to be an interruption in the ongoingness of the secular. So in that sense, I find one of the things I find in Nate's work to be extremely provocative in that regard is his constant transmutation of these elements, narrative, poetic elements that they're weaving in and out of the mythic and the religious. He's always invoking religiosity, but he's never lingering there too long. And I find, in terms of your similarly provocative question about who's the one or the figure that we're looking toward or maybe aspiring toward in the work, the thing that I find, I just find myself located in and then sometimes cast overboard with is Nate's pronominal disruptions. You never can tell who the we is. You're never sure who the I is. One of the poems that I quoted from is Sound and Severance, which appears in Nod House. And there are these devastating slaps in the face with pronouns in that poem, because he invokes the Rastafarian I and I, but he does it as he and he. And then he's not satisfied with that, because he and he's I and I will have something to say. So suddenly you're in the possessive of this sort of collective singular pronominal reality, and he's just messing with you. He's messing with you. And so that element, the sort of trickster, like what saying element of it, it feels like he invites me into this collective we, and then ejects me from it, and then draws me back in. It's the Gnostic stranger I embraced as though it was me I embraced.
I would like to say that I think a genuine question that threads itself throughout the work is, what is soul? And he neither wants to embrace soul as a basic bottom term, nor does he want to get rid of it. And so there's that commitment in the work. And in terms of the erotic, here's a difference, a great difference between Nate and Duncan. Duncan says at one time that the myth of Psyche and
Eros. Yeah.
Psyche and Eros is the myth of the lover and the beloved, and Psyche is the soul. and Eros is the lover. And I think there's a binary that is truly disruptive to erotic love relations, is that binary between the lover and the beloved. And I would say that one of the things that he undoes in his work is that binary between the lover and the beloved, partially through language as an act of the instant, so that he's not disclosing or getting rid of the intensity of sex, love, etc., but rather reconfiguring the language of it. So that things carry through that are traditional, but they're disruptive.
If it's okay, because I want to make sure we get around to other questions, but I would like to just respond, even briefly, to this response here. It does seem to me, and I'm going to resist, I think, your question. It resists, I think, one of the crucial premises that I think is going on in your question, and then I want to suggest a way of reading Nate's work, quite apart whether Nate will buy this or not, but this is me engaging Nate for my own kind of constructive critical aims as part of the response here. It seems to me that part of what's going on in your question is a kind of conflation or an aggregation of the notion of the sacred to the notion of religion, which then stands over against the notion of the secular, to which you then want to read Nate. I want to strongly push back against this. I think part of what's at stake in what, at least in my own kind of engagement with Nate's work, is precisely the way in which the binary of the secular and the religious, which also gets aggregated to the sacred, works. I'll just invoke a few people. People like Tomoko Masuzawa, David Chidester, Gil Anidjar, who's working and thinking in relationship to Said. But then I will also strongly invoke at this point also Sylvia Wynter, as well as a number of other people, particularly inside of Black radical thinking, in which the notion of the secular and the notion of the religious are jointly stitched together in the production of the myth of the political that I was trying to actually take down. In other words, Black radical thinking, and I would argue the poetics that moves in relationship to it, is a critique of that binary as part of settler colonial containment. Which then means we have to think some other excessive third move. I'm trying to take the word sacred and try and functionalize it in terms of this excess right here. But even as I do that, I'm like, and this, I do this in both the paper, but much more extensively in the book. I now have to rewrite even the way in which the notion of the sacred works, because of the way in which we tend to aggregate it to the religious, and particularly the Christian discursive overdetermination of what the sacred even means. I'm pulling all of that apart.
Okay. Well, how then would you answer René Girard, who inextricably binds the sacred to violence?
Yes. Okay, yeah, I'm fearful of, because I don't want to go too far down, I don't want to have a conversation, but really, I really try and deal quite extensively with this. But the very short answer with René Girard is, I want to answer René Girard by invoking Nobezi Philip, actually. That's the way I want to respond to Girard, because what Nobezi Philip says in the Notanda essay to Zong is she invokes actually the shaman and the figure of the Orisha. And she says that what she does in the text, in the composition of Zong as a poem, she says that her hands got bloodied with all of the cutting of the text. And she explicitly connects this to a move of sacrifice. This is her words, not mine. But by the time she's done with laying out what she means by sacrifice, what's being cut is the legal text and the presumption of the legal text of the fictive, violent, self-possessed individual that animates legal textual production. And that was the violence that has the black in the hold. So the cutting of the legal text is a sacrifice against sacrifice, but Nobezi's sacrifice is the cutting of the idea, the myth of the violent individual self-possessed subject. And that gives you then a text in which you don't have a single author in a certain sense. It's another imagination of I and I-ness, he and he-ness, so on and so forth. So now you can actually bring together in a certain way Norbezi's mode of poeticizing and what I would read as some of the stakes involved in Nate's poetics. For me, this is a part of a broader landscape of a kind of black poetics, as a poetics of the sacred, that isn't reproducing the logics of sacrality in its overdetermined historical Christian settler colonial theologization. So I just threw a lot out there, but I hope it's clear enough that what I'm doing here is really trying to cut open not just the ontology of brutality in settler colonialism, but the ontotheology of it all, in which the notion of the excessive basically is being subjected to would-be propertization, right, and individuation and individualization, which is the brutality that the poetic, in I would argue Mackey's sense, Norbezi's sense, and others, is trying to cut open again. So this is a different operation of the sacred. I am poeticizing the sacred, even poeticizing against sacrifice. Yes, and then that was another question.
Just one piggyback on Bob's comments and these questions, and these really actually compelling answers to it. I too tend to read Nate in a more secular fashion than not. So the one piggybacking question I would have would be, just as we were looking for different kinds of critical vocabulary to talk about music, sound, etc. this morning, I would ask the question, or just kind of leave it out there in the air. What does using the vocabulary of the sacred get us in our reading of the poetry that we can't get otherwise? But that's not my question, really. It's a question. It's not my question. But a question really for you, Norman. I'm really interested in the things that you said about self-interruption within myth. And I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, because it's not clear to me whether you want to suggest that there's a self-interrupting component to all mythical thinking, or mythical imagining,
I don't
or
think
whether
I
you're
can go
talking
that
about like a formal feature
No,
of certain mythic narratives, or what?
I don't think I could go that far as to say that it's all self-interrupting, and that probably means I depart from Jean-Luc Nancy's notion. But rather, and here I think Jerry's idea comes in really good, Rothenberg's idea, that it's this self-interrupting or self-critical quality or self-reflexive quality that happens when myth is incorporated into artistic representation. Which is to say, I would have to make a distinction between popularization of myth as ideology, which reverts to a certain kind of tribalism and gets us into a lot of trouble, the kind of trouble that we're in currently, versus the way in which myth comes to be not so much appropriated but utilized by the artist. Whether that artist is a shaman performing her dances, or the mystic writing, or Abraham Abulafia writing, mystical texts, seeking the divine, or a poet. The aims are in some respects the same, the aims are in some respects different, but what is operative in all of them, I think, is a certain kind of self-reflection that is not there when one simply equates myth with ideology, which of course I definitely disagree with. But does that answer? Okay. Yeah.
Jay, I was really captivated by your reading of Adam as the M and the Y, among other things, the M and the Y inverted and split open, and giving us all sorts of, holding an infinite set of parasemiotic possibilities in that embrace. And I was also thinking about how in the process, the silent interdental phoneme becomes voiced, acquires a voice, right? And how appropriate if we think about maybe giving voice in a choir's vibration as well, so it becomes a, how Mickey gives voice to a complete new understanding of, I think you called it mythography, not mythopoetics, right? And I was thinking also now I'm having different thoughts about how we might be able to see in the myth that we are stirred by the them, right? And I was also, this is just to say that I found it infinitely generative and it's making me think about so many other things, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what is enabled also in the sonic change that occurs from myth to idiom, which of course makes us think of rhythm, but
But that's what I was like trying to, and you helping me actually. That's what I was trying to get at with what's at stake in the TH. It's like kind of gestural sound, sound never finished, right? It's bringing me back to some of the stuff this morning that was said about like becoming. I had some other notes that I took somewhere. I'm not gonna find them, like from this morning about incompletion. I want to like think about that TH as sonic, like kind of striving towards completion, but always incomplete, which then like kind of generates more like possibilities by way of the way in which I talked about the inversion and the splitting open, and then the TH as something always being birthed forth, right, as a kind of ethnic generativity or something. So I mean, I'm just like riffing off of you now. I mean, that's what I'm trying to like, get at, and yeah. So I don't know what else to say. Thank you.
This is a little left fieldy, but I'm wondering, and I know it doesn't play out etymologically, but somehow when I think myth, mouth, mythos, moo, the word mother comes up. And that's a kind of a suppressed discourse, but very much present, I think, in a strange way, in Mackie's work. So I just want to put that out there for other people to hold.
There are references to the mother from a book of bottle, traces of perfume still in the night, which shows the figure and called to memory through the figure of the mother, and not adequately to N's own estimation responsive to the mother. But very, very few references that I can.
Well, the mother is the broken bond itself.
I mean, I sort of like, so I've been reading a lot of Nate, and Fred is here too, so I read a lot of Fred. So these are folks who like really influenced me, and so I'm thinking about, I mean, I was writing here, it's like, what if we said that idiom is myth's subjection to like a kind of sexual cut, right? So what if what's at stake in myth as kind of political imposition, the establishment of normative order, some sort of order that wants to claim normativity, is also the imposition of what Hortense Spillers would call phallic sovereignty. And therefore, if idioms moving inside of myth, sleeping inside of myth, is a kind of sexual cut against the myth. And therefore, a kind of imagination, right, that will open up another way to think motherhood and generativity through the violence of patriarchal imposition. And so I definitely had something like that, though I didn't have those words that I just uttered until the question like circulated, with the notion of the inverting of the M and the Y, and then the splitting open and another sound is like kind of ushering forth. And I call this even a womb space, echoing a little bit of Wilson Harris as well. So I am like doing that and trying to work out a vocabulary and a language to think about, one might say, the ungendered, and this is Spillers again, the ungenderedness of idiom. as sexually cutting myth. And that's what I mean then when I say the poetics of the sacred, or a mode of sacrifice that is actually the sacrifice against the imposition of phallic singularity, right? Another kind of accrual where allness is not the kind of complete phallic stability, but something like an ongoing accrual.
I would say just from a psychoanalytic perspective, that we're looking at a shift. And I'm thinking about like all of my reading of Nate's work. We're thinking about a shift from an Oedipal to a pre-Oedipal. You know, where kind of object relations sort of analysis would be necessary. Because I find it's so refreshing to find so little of Oedipal conflict in Nate, you know, which is like not what you get usually in a male author. You know, so where is that being displaced to? I mean, my suspicion is it's being displaced to this remarkable we that he has come to invent, both in the poetry and in the prose. And more needs to be done with what's going on within that we, which is emanational. I mean, if you want to shift from psychoanalytic to Kabbalistic, it's emanational, right? Or Neoplatonism, you know, and it's you know, I mean, are these objects, you know, these beloved objects also, you know, emanations of the Godhead? I would probably say yes, but I'm going out on a limb there. Yeah.
But that leads to a couple of archetypal notions that I think are repeatedly exhibited in the poems, in the serial poems. So, you know, in terms of myths of origin, myths of creation, there are two figures that they repeat in all different mythologies, all different narratives. One is emanation. There's some point at which some divine power exceeds itself and begins to flow out, and then in the flowing out, all of reality comes into being. And then the other is arousal.
Right.
It's like emanation and arousal. Those are deeply Kabbalistic figures, but you find them universally. So in that sense, it's a kind of the eroticism which you're inscribing in terms of the UJ are inscribing in terms of the disruption of this colonial, the mythical paradigm of colonialism, if I can put it that way. That eroticism, which we've alluded to, and I was talking with Bob about this during the break between the two sessions before. That's this incredibly fecund part of Nate's work. There's so much eros, and it's especially it's mostly oral sex. You know, it's just a lot of oral sex in the poem. Just saying. So like that.
Right.
These are things that I've noticed.
But I'm a math guy. You've got to give me numbers.
245.
Well, this is sort of tracking back for a moment, but I certainly understand what you're saying about how myths secure colonialism, and that there's kind of the myth of the state of Godhead, etc. But there's also a whole kind of set of stories and myths that are very open-ended and capacious, that are definite but indefinite. And I'm thinking about the way the Song of the Andunbulus, which is an actual myth that Nate tells, is in fact something that he returns to again and again, that actually anchors the poetry. So in terms of myth being different when it's in literature, I don't quite agree agree with that. I just think that there are many different kinds of myths and stories, and they operate quite differently in the culture. And one of the things I was thinking in the session this morning, and I think it's great to celebrate and totally appropriate to celebrate the extreme sort of variation, variety, thickness of texture, a disruption in Nate's work. That's very important. But Duncan said this one thing about myth that I found interesting. He said that when we turn to myth, we have to give up variegation. The myth allows for a recognition of ourselves and also helps us. So we see ourselves in the myth, but it also recognizes us. So it's sort of the sense of, well, what play does sort of coherent, cohesion, the generality that is conducted through story or myth, what different kinds of plays can it have? And then the question would be, why does Nate go to the Song of Andambulus again and again and again? His work is a repetition of the same that he notes elsewhere in other writers, and it's an extreme repetition of a specific myth that has been attached to, say, Gnostic myths. So what is that choice of something that tells a story that is general versus the thickness of variegation or the thickness of rhythm?
Can I piggyback a little bit on this pronoun thing, the we, the mysterious we, and to say that it resonates for me with Kamau Brathwaite's we, M-W-E, which he uses like I and I, or a kind of fragmented and yet generalizable subjectivity, which is his shattered psyche or his historically traumatized self. And just to say that again, it's an M coming up against, with an M and an E, with a W thrust in the middle, and a W, of course, is a splayed figure, which maybe plays the same role as the TH. So, and of course, with Mackie, it's the M that's displaced the M word. So, I don't know, just a little more letter magic.
So there's better. And I just want to make sure I'm not missing by anybody in the back.
Just kind of across the board, like I'm listening, everybody's put out there, keep getting sort of echoes to like Zhuangzi, the Taoist, kind of like his butterfly of like, you know, Zhuangzi dreamt he was a butterfly, wakes up, and sort of is my butterfly dreaming myself back and forth. And so kind of the secular and myth and kind of those resistance kind of in kind of the very non-sacred, very kind of hunting type of Taoism is like kind of echoes sort of coming across.
I would suggest that the mediating condition that we very, very barely touched on is the dream state and dream time.
I touched on it.
You touched on it.
It wasn't there.
You run with it.
It wasn't there. I touched on it.
Okay, right. I mean, and you know, Duncan talks about Alcharinga and there's the Australian dream time, and well, you talk more about that. I mean, I see it as mediating between the mythic and the secular, actually.
The whole trilogy's third, not trilogy anymore. Starts with, you should have heard me in the dream last night.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, for me, the dream, or if you want to think of it a little bit in a fancier sense, this oniric imperative that's the thing that enables the poems to keep going, because thinking even specifically about dream analysis, something Norman's familiar with. One of the things that happens in a dream analysis situation is that you can never catch up.
Right.
The dreamer is super abundant.
Right.
There are always more dreams coming, and the dreams continue to exhibit mythical textures.
And Freud says, never worry about it.
Yeah.
There's always going to be
Keep going on, yeah. But the other thing too is they really the most recent dream always absorbs our attention and imagination, because it seems to be speaking to all these concerns, or it sends up mysteries. Priscilla, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the side in terms of the sacred debate, of the people who are seeing the sacred. And there are two words, one that has come up, cosmological, and one that hasn't, liminal, that I think are really important for thinking about the sacred. And Jay, I keep waiting for you to talk about blackness and the sacred, so can I open the window for you to?
Well, the fuller essay is called Black Malpractice, A Poetics of the Sacred. And then the book that this is excerpted and coming out of is called Black Rapture, A Poetics of the Sacred. And the claim that I'm really trying to develop is that blackness as excessiveness, as that which kind of like solicits against the totality, is precisely what I mean by sacred. Sacredness is not an object. It's not a thing. The thingification of the sacred its reduction to a God term in that regard, such that the sacred becomes a stand-in for God. That's what I call propertizing the sacred. That propertizing of the sacred is the mythic gesture for the propertizing of the earth. And that's why that operation of the propertizing of the sacred becomes, one might say, the ground zero of what some people might call anti-blackness. Now that then means then you can't think blackness as property either. Right? It's the movement against property through property. So that's the way in which I connect blackness and the sacred.
And that's also where the sacred becomes attached to the religious, which I agree with you, it should not be.
It should not be, because again, the secular, along with the religious, are modalities of propertization. So to say, my basic claim, to put it as forcefully as I can, to try and take respite in the secular is just, one might say, the flip side of trying to take a certain respite in the religious, insofar as both are propertizing gestures, right? Whose kind of projection is the figure of the individual. And so this, for me, is what's at stake in this kind of what we've been calling the mysterious we. Because again, this isn't even the propertized we that sort of gets politicized in we the people. Because that we is also a propertized we, right? The we of the state, which requires borders and so on and so forth. This is some other kind of mysterious we that moves against we-ness as we know it. So Nobezi Phillips has this formulation in one of her essays in which she says, we need a new language for this usness. And I take it that Nate's poetics is forging a poetics of this otherwise we-ness and usness.
Can I add something to that quick, which is one thing I noticed in Nate's work, it's a really powerful generative feature, is that he frequently uses the we, or the we introduces the subjunctive mood. So it was a book we were reading it, if it were a book, something like so. And that were the subjunctive mood. Well, that's the grammar of dreams. Dreams are constantly in the state of if. So that in that sense, I really like your sense that Nate's mysterious we it's resisting what you're calling propertization, or it's resisting some kind of manipulable characterization.
Right. And that brings us to like liminality.
Yeah,
that,
it's a liminal we.
It's a liminal we. And the subjunctive, I think, is right. I mean, I'm still thinking about the resistance of the object now from in the break, in which Fred has that moment where he gives like this reading of what Marx does, right? If the I think it's if the slave or something like that could speak, it would say. And Fred turns attention to the subjunctive at that point, you know, and also noting that actually there were slaves, as it were, at the time that Marx is writing, and they are speaking, right? And so I think that this again is like maybe a kind of theoretical complement to the kind of poetics that we're talking about here.
Joe's he's about to bring the gong out.
Yeah, I'm told that we have 5 minutes. Are you saying 5 minutes? All right.
So I want to ask a question about myth that actually relates to musical performance, and I actually want to pick up on a moment and ask you, I want to read something from Basic Cathedral and ask you to respond to it that ties together threads about our laughter and the discomfort and the discussion of sex. The difference between like sacred, myth, and sensuality in Mackie as opposed to kind of sex in Mackie, or moving from oral sex to group sex. And the reason I'm asking that question is not at all to go into the space of a kind of profane, although the sacred and profane are always moving back and forth each other, but I was thinking about the mythos of the way we mythologize, even if you think about the flyer, the way we mythologize jazz performance sessions, right, or like an audience performance, and once you're thinking of, like once you hear the erotic, it's like hard not to see it, and so I'm wondering if you can talk about the way, I'll read it and then see if you hear it. It's the ecstatic experience of listening to a set that becomes a particular form of group erotic experience that then becomes mythologized in the epistolary form of Mackie. So I'll just read it and then you can respond to it. Through Andrew Just, we played our record release gig at the studio last night. There were plenty of copies of Orphic Ben on hand, of course, and we managed to sell a goodly few. We played a couple of sets, after each of which we went out and milled around with the audience rather than stay backstage. The gig had been billed as a record release party. We even got asked by more than 1 or 2 people to autograph their copies. The pieces we played were all, with one exception, from Orphic Ben. We were in good form and acquitted ourselves well on every piece, each of which had its moments and got good audience response, both as it unfolded and when it came to an end. The evening was a series of peaks, one could say without exaggeration, the highest coming during its finale. The night's highlight turned out to be not only the last piece we played, but also the one piece which wasn't from Orphic Ben. So I'm going to stop there, but like the kind of the language of kind of orgasmic kind of tension and release is so built into this kind of we don't, like as Britt said earlier, there are these moments we don't get to hear this performance, right? We don't, and so there's like the kind of the pent up eroticism of hesitation or what's anticipated but not realized, which is the if of the subjunctive mood. But I'm curious about whether or not you think that in Mackie's relationship to like the erotic and the sacred and the mythos, it's a kind of deconstruction of that. Is he messing with us? Is he puncturing through that kind of way that we tend to kind of mythologize, right? That kind of, or is he actually kind of pointing to it as a sacred experience, right? Is he pointing, is it a meta-commentary on our mythologization of that process of kind of the set experience of a session, or is it actually something that's interrupting it? I'm not sure. It's a really, I don't have an agenda in the question in terms of I think I know. I really wanted to hear, based on what you all said.
It looks like Fred might have an answer.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't.
Right?
It's just a kind of marginal note to your question.
Okay.
Which is that it's just something that Peter said, but it seems like oral sex in Nate's work, and particularly in light of Ed's poem last night about the gored bullfighter, is a matter that takes place between men and their horns.
We can't top that. That's it.